Hello world, this is Serena and today I'm going to interview Amazawa Sha. He's
Hello.
an assisting completion process practitioner. This is why his name is Amazawa. Just kidding. So Amazawa has helped a lot of people. He's like a completion process superhero, and one of the people that he saved happens to be me, and this is the reason why I have the privilege to interview him today. So I strongly believe that this information needs to be shared with the world, and let's just start asking questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Serena. It was quite a pleasure to meet you and to facilitate your rebirth. It was very much a pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you as well. It is a great pleasure to meet you and have you as my friend. So, first question.
Okay.
If you were to describe the completion process to a person who has never heard of it before, what would you say?
How I would describe it would be, I would first give a little background. The completion process was a process that was put together by Teal Swan. And Teal is someone who has experienced a very traumatic past, like severe abuse and even torture by a ritual cult. And so she had a lot of healing to do. And so she went through all sorts of different types of therapy, all sorts of different processes for healing from her trauma. And when she went through all those therapies, she saw the pluses and minuses of all the different processes. And it wasn't enough to bring her to a state that she wanted to arrive at. So then she had to create her own way of healing herself. And then coming out of the integration, she took all these various parts of the process that has benefited her and put it together into her own process that she calls the completion process. And it's basically a combination of inner child work and soul retrieval, and it's very effective. I also like the way she describes how the process works. It's like a natural rebirth. And the way it works is Teal is extrasensory, so she can see our energy body. And she says when she sees our energy body, our traumas are like little wormholes that are in our energy body. And those wormholes activate and open up when something triggers our emotion that's associated with that trauma. So for example, if we had trauma around certain types of abuse, when we encounter a situation that reminds us of that abuse, we trigger the emotion that we felt, or in that original trauma will trigger like fear or like basically fear and other emotions that may be associated with that trauma. So when that trigger emotion comes up, the wormhole opens, and by allowing ourselves to fully feel that emotion, it's like going through the wormhole, going back in time to when that original trauma occurred. Tio explains that it's really quite easy for our emotional body and our mental body to actually time travel. And so I personally sense it as truly going back in time to where that trauma occurred. And usually it's an inner child of ours. It's a small child in our past that is experiencing that trauma. And that trauma is so threatening, so painful, so overwhelming that we had to repress it. And that's why the child is stuck back there. So when we go back and we find the inner child, we basically allow the inner child to feel the emotions that they're feeling. It'll be very similar to the one that we used, the triggered emotion that we used to travel back through the wormhole. We help the child understand there's nothing wrong with them for feeling these powerful emotions. And by holding space for the child and being with the child, we help it fully feel the emotion, just let it wash over. And that releases the child from being stuck back there. It's basically taking that trauma out of the subconscious, putting it into the light of consciousness, and therefore releasing the child from being stuck back there. And then once the child has calmed down and has fully felt the emotion, you will feel like sort of a relief in the child. And when that happens, then the child is ready to move on. And then we can ask the child, well, what would make you feel better under the circumstances? And the child will naturally explain to us what their needs are, and then we can meet those needs. Now, within the construct of the completion process, we're dealing with a quantum universe. We're in a thought form world where anything is possible, as long as that's our intention. So we can do anything that the child wants, including like rescue them from somebody who's abusing them. We could take the abuser and get them re-educated, or whatever the child wants to make the child feel better, so that we reframe the trauma into a very positive experience. Now, personally, the way I experience CP myself, and when I'm facilitating someone, is when we do that, we're literally helping the child jump from one life path to another, right? So the original life path was that of experiencing that trauma, repressing it, and that created the pattern that carried on all the way to the present and is causing the painful triggers to reoccur over and over again. When we meet the needs of the child, and basically the child is jumping to another life path, and then that life path, the experience is a positive one. So the pattern is not there. And then when we carry that experience forward, it literally changes our life. So for example, I had a very painful childhood. And as I keep bringing my children to a new life path, now when I think back on my childhood, instead of all the painful traumas that I experienced originally, I'm actually naturally feeling the positive experiences that the new life path brings to me. And the result of that is basically I reintegrate the soul energy that got trapped back there. And I very naturally feel positive emotions rather than the triggering negative ones. So that's how I experience CP, completion process. And that's how I understand it. It's really a rebirth into another life path, and allowing that to come to our present moment. And I recall a very powerful moment when doing that brought me out of a very deep depression where I was suicidal into a calm peace. It was almost as if a switch turned off. So that's how powerful it is when we can jump to another life path and bring it forward to the present. Yeah. Is there any questions about that you wanted to ask me, Serena?
Not necessarily about that, but about other aspects of it. I can relate to the inner shift that occurs into the reality. And right now I was wondering how did you discover the completion process, and how did you decide to become a facilitator, a practitioner?
Yeah, sure. I talked about coming out of a deep depression through the completion process. And so that's how I discovered the completion process. It wasn't even like someone facilitating me. I was very depressed, and so I was looking for something to help. And I came across Teal's, a recording of Teal's synchronization workshop in Paris. And I didn't know at the time that she had synchronization workshops. So I was very curious, and I started to listen to it. And in that workshop, Teal did 2 completion process on stage for 2 ladies, like back to back. And so when I listened to the first completion process, I started to understand the concept, and I started to like absorb it. And when she started bringing the second lady through the completion process, and interestingly, the lady's trauma was very similar to mine. She was an unwanted child. Her mom wanted to abort her, and that was my trauma. And so when she started going through the completion process, I followed along, and I've all of a sudden accessed the memory of being in my mom's womb, feeling the emotion of not being wanted, and understanding that my mom wanted to abort me. And then that awareness was amazing. Like, I never knew this. Nobody told me this. And later on, I was able to confirm with my mother that it actually was true. That's what I remember, is what what happened. But once that memory came and I was able to hold awareness for my fetal self and allow the emotions to pass through, at that time I didn't really help the fetus come to a different life path, but just the awareness of that and just allowing the emotions to be accepted, knowing that there's nothing wrong with me for feeling this, traumatic, painful emotion. When I came out of that, I was no longer depressed. And I go, wow, what happened? It was like a switch, like I said, turned off, and I felt peace. It was a sad peace, but it was definitely peace. And I can tell that urge, that voice that was constantly saying, you know what, we don't want to be here. Let's just end it now. Let's just end it now. That's just end. That voice stopped. And I go, wow, what is this? So that was my first experience of the completion process. This was right before Teal published her book. So then I got online and I started finding everything that she's ever said about the completion process, because I was so impressed with it. And I wanted to learn how to do this because of what I've experienced. And then I started to practice it on some of my friends who were willing to let me practice it on them. And I saw the shift in them. And from that point forward, I was in love. I was in love with this rebirth process. And when I learned that Teal was accepting people to train to be, facilitators, I immediately put in an application. I remember it was 2:00 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and I was online and I saw Teal announce her new website. So I went to her new website and I started poking around, and then there was this page for applying to be certified as a practitioner for the completion process. And right away, my heart blossomed, and I said, I'm doing this. So 2:00 in the morning, I typed out the application, sent it there, and I just had a knowing that, oh, I'm going to be picked. I'm going to be picked. And I let that go. And a month later, I got my invitation to my training class. That was September of 2016. Life-changing experience being trained by Teal and being certified. Yes.
That sounds amazing.
It was. It really is a life-changing experience to have experienced Teal's training.
I want to do it too.
Go for it. Go for it.
Yes. So the next question was supposed to be about the way the process has impacted the life of the people you are working with. But since I am one of them, I could as well just start sharing my side of the story as well. And I can remember that exactly before our last session, you asked me if I want to share knowledge with the world and if I want to make a YouTube video or a channel or a blog and start writing. And I said, no, I'm only 19. I'm not ready to share all this with the world. And then exactly after the session, I started a blog and I started writing daily, and I started working as an energy healer, so I am a great example for this drastic shift in my life. I totally feel that I've entered another life path and I am a completely new person. So yes, what other experiences like this do you feel inspired to share?
Yeah, well, that's a beautiful experience you have. And I'm so happy to see that occur for you. For me, what I've seen is that it really is a natural rebirth process. And for me, it's also something that our being, each one of our being, naturally flow towards once we feel safe. So it could be unique to every single person, because each person's desire and what they want to experience in this life is different. So what I've seen over and over again is what Teal talks about, that we come into this life wanting to experience something. And so, of course, to experience it, we have to experience the opposite first. So we usually get into our situation, like if I want to experience love, I come into a situation where I get to experience the contrast of lack of love first. And then